I arrived at the community hall in Cleveland just as the sun dipped below the horizon, its fading light catching on the glass doors as I stepped inside. The night was meant to celebrate my mother's recognition for years of charity work in the neighborhood, and the entire space had been transformed into something that looked more like a wedding venue than a church hall. String lights hung in perfect rows, golden against the white walls, and polished tables gleamed with glassware neatly arranged. Everywhere I looked, familiar faces from the church and the neighborhood gathered in their Sunday best, murmuring politely while waiting for the evening to begin. I should have felt proud walking into that room, proud that my family was being honored in front of so many. Instead, a knot formed in my stomach. These events had always been complicated for me. Every detail seemed to reinforce the invisible hierarchy my mother enforced between her children. Memories came rushing back of family dinners where my brothers and sisters were praised while I sat quietly, waiting for my turn that never came. Even now, at 35, I carried those moments like bricks in my chest. At the door, one of my relatives spotted me. He raised his eyebrows as though surprised to see me at all. "Didn't think you'd make it," he said, a glass of wine already in his hand. "I wouldn't miss Mom's big night," I answered evenly. My voice was calm, but I caught the flicker of disbelief in his eyes. "Good for you," he muttered, already turning away to greet someone else. I inhaled slowly, forcing myself not to let that small jab dig too deep. Maya Angelou's words echoed in my mind. "People will forget what you said, but they will never forget how you made them feel." Tonight, I already knew how I'd feel, unseen. At the registration table, a volunteer smiled warmly as she handed me a badge. I glanced down. The plastic square, neatly printed, didn't carry my name. Instead, it read, "Helper." I froze. "Excuse me," I began, ready to point out the mistake, but the volunteer had already moved on to greet another guest. I held the badge in my hand for a moment, debating whether to correct it. Around me, I noticed the badges pinned to my siblings' clothes. Guest of honor. Keynote family. Even their titles seemed to shine brighter. I pinned helper to my blouse. Part of me wanted to test the room, to see how they reacted when I wore a label that erased me. As I stepped forward, my cousin Elise caught sight of it and burst out laughing. "Well, at least they gave you a job tonight," she teased, sipping her champagne. I forced a smile, unwilling to let her see how the words stung. My face stayed calm, but my chest tightened. That one word on my chest summed up years of being mislabeled, miscast, misunderstood. Titles in America carry weight. Doctor, CEO, director. Mine tonight was helper, a title that didn't describe my work, my sacrifices, or my value, but rather how small they believed I was. With the badge pinned firmly in place, I walked deeper into the hall. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses surrounded me. My mother, Athalia, stood near the stage, radiant as ever. She wore a navy gown that shimmered under the lights, her pearl necklace gleaming against her skin. She held court effortlessly, guests circling her with admiration. My siblings were nearby, drawing their own crowd. My older brother shook hands confidently, his work as an engineer earning praise. My sister leaned in close to a group of women who admired her new teaching award. Every introduction was another chance for my mother to highlight their achievements, another opportunity to remind everyone that her children were successful. I slipped toward the back, where the soda station sat unattended. I poured myself a ginger ale and settled into a chair. While the others drank wine and champagne, I sipped quietly, blending into the background. From my seat, I heard a whisper. Two relatives, standing not far from me, spoke softly, but not softly enough. "Isn't she the one who fixes broken gadgets?" one asked. "Yes," the other replied, her tone dismissive. "She tinkers with old radios, coffee makers, things people usually throw away." The words carried no malice, just indifference, which somehow hurt more. They had summarized my life's work in a sentence, erasing the hours, the dedication, the steady business I had built from scratch. I stared at the name tag again, the word helper pressing into the fabric of my blouse like a cruel joke. Around me, the scene resembled a play. My mother was the star, my siblings the celebrated supporting cast, and I was the extra sitting in the shadows, invisible unless someone needed a line to laugh at. A ripple of applause spread through the hall as the MC stepped onto the stage, announcing that the program was about to begin. My mother moved gracefully toward the podium, the spotlight catching her features. She accepted the microphone, smiling as the room quieted in anticipation. I knew what was coming. She had done this countless times before, using the stage to thank the community, then transitioning into a list of family accomplishments. For her, success was measured by degrees earned, salaries collected, and appearances maintained. Love was conditional, based on performance. Quiet resilience, like mine, never counted. The crowd clapped enthusiastically as she began to thank the church, the neighborhood, and the organizers. Her voice carried effortlessly, honed by years of speaking in front of others. I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. I glanced again at the badge. Helper. Its sharp corners pressed into me, mocking me, reminding me that no matter what I built, this was how they would frame me. The air in the hall grew heavier as my mother prepared to shift her speech from community thanks to family recognition. I braced myself, every nerve in my body on alert. She glanced toward me, just for a moment, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. My chest tightened. Then she said something into the microphone that made the crowd chuckle, though I couldn't hear the words over the hum of nervous anticipation. My stomach dropped. I knew where this was heading. It always started small, a misstep, a mislabel, a helper badge. But tonight, I sensed she was ready to raise the stakes. And that's when I realized my humiliation had only just begun. The applause still echoed as my mother adjusted the microphone on the podium. I held my breath, waiting for her words to cut closer, but the MC quickly announced a brief intermission before the formal speeches began. People scattered to refill drinks and stretch their legs. I rose with the rest of them, though I wasn't headed to greet anyone. A volunteer guided me toward a table in the far corner, near the doors where the catering staff slipped in and out carrying trays. I scanned the seating chart posted near the entrance. My siblings' names were neatly printed on cards that placed them close to the stage, the honored tables, while mine was wedged in with a handful of distant relatives and community members I barely knew. The message was clear. In America, where you sit often defines your value. Front row for achievers, back row for those who don't matter. At my table, a cousin raised his glass with a smirk. "At least from here you can sneak out early if it gets boring," he said, chuckling at his own joke. The others laughed politely. I offered a thin smile, careful not to show how his words landed. I pulled out the chair, its legs scraping against the polished floor, and sat down. The soda glass in my hand felt heavy, condensation slipping down my fingers. Around me, conversations bloomed, not directed at me, but over me, like I was part of the furniture. They praised Athalia's tireless dedication, compared notes about my siblings' careers, and shared plans for their next vacation. One elderly neighbor leaned toward me briefly. "Your mother must be so proud of all her children," she said warmly, then turned back to someone else before I could reply. Bitterness pressed against my ribs. This seat was not just a chair. It was a statement. Earlier that afternoon, I had chosen a gift with care, something I believed would mean more than jewelry or a check. I had spent hours restoring an old black-and-white photo of my parents from their early marriage, a moment when my father still looked at her with awe, and she smiled without calculating how it might be perceived. I found a frame of polished oak, simple but dignified, and wrapped it in tissue paper myself. It wasn't expensive, but it carried history. When I arrived, I placed it carefully on the gift table, sliding it into the center so it couldn't be missed. I imagined, just for a moment, that it might soften her, remind her that someone remembered the years before all of this performance. Later, as I passed the gift table again, I saw my frame nearly buried under boxes of jewelry, bottles of wine, and a sealed envelope I knew must contain a donation in her honor. My mother accepted each offering with loud gratitude, kissing cheeks and praising her children for their generosity. My siblings were applauded for the lavish things they brought. But the frame with my father's young face staring out at her, she hadn't touched it. The tissue paper sagged where it had been shoved aside. There was no acknowledgement, no thank you, no glance in my direction. My throat tightened. Oprah once said, "Lots of people want to ride with you in the limo, but what you want is someone who will take the bus with you when the limo breaks down." I guess my gift was the bus ticket no one wanted. I returned to my marginal seat, determined not to let the sting show. The band played softly, filling the silence with familiar tunes while waiters cleared plates. Around me, my table mates exchanged idle remarks. One relative leaned over. "She doesn't have much, does she?" she whispered to another. "Still tinkering with gadgets, I heard." The other nodded. "Yes, fixing coffee makers and old radios. Bless her heart." I lifted the soda glass to my lips, letting the carbonation bite against my tongue instead of letting their words pierce deeper. To them, I wasn't a woman who had built a business from nothing, who had learned to fix what others discarded. I was just the broke one, the helper. A man across the table cleared his throat. "So, what exactly do you do these days?" he asked casually. His tone carried more judgment than curiosity. I met his eyes and answered simply, "I run a repair service. Small appliances, electronics, things people need working to get through their day." He nodded vaguely, uninterested, and immediately turned the conversation back to my sister's teaching award. I pressed my palm against the tablecloth, grounding myself. Silence, I reminded myself, can protect dignity better than over-explaining. Every detail I gave would only invite more dismissal. In American families, achievements are often measured in diplomas, titles, and paychecks, rarely in resilience. From my seat in the back, I had a clear view of the stage. My mother was adjusting her notes, preparing to resume her speech. The hum of conversation around me faded as the spotlight returned to her. My stomach tightened. This was the part I dreaded most. I had watched her do this before, turn her speech from community service into a litany of family achievements. The eldest son, the daughter with degrees, the shining stars. And then me, if I was mentioned at all, a footnote, a punchline. The ignored gift, the wrong seat, the whispers at my back. Every detail of the evening had been leading here. As the crowd settled, Athalia looked up, her eyes scanning the room before locking on me, cold, deliberate. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, sharp as glass. I gripped my soda tighter, the condensation running down to my wrist. The glass threatened to slip, but I held it firm. I had been left out before, countless times. But tonight, I could sense she was sharpening her words for me, preparing to carve me into the role she had chosen long ago. And as the crowd leaned in for her next words, I realized my backseat humiliation was only the beginning. I stayed in my chair at the far end of the room, the soda glass damp in my hand as the condensation trailed down my palm. The crowd hushed when my mother leaned back toward the microphone, her posture straight, her pearls catching the glow of the spotlight. I could see her eyes move deliberately across the hall, pausing for a moment on me before she turned away, as if even a glance in my direction might sully her perfect speech. Those brief looks cut sharper than any words. Around me, I caught others copying her cues. Some relatives avoided eye contact altogether, their gazes fixed firmly on the stage. Others glanced at me quickly, then dismissed me with a tiny shake of the head, as though I wasn't worth acknowledgement. It was strange, I thought, how silence and looks could weigh more than insults. They shrink you without anyone saying a word. I shifted in my chair, set the glass down on the linen-covered table, and straightened my back. I refused to hunch into invisibility, even if they all seemed to believe that was where I belonged. Then came the part I knew too well. My mother's voice lifted, smooth as a rehearsed performance. She began praising each of my siblings. First came my brother, introduced proudly as the lawyer who had made the family name proud in every courtroom he entered. The room clapped, nodding with admiration. Then my sister, a teacher who shaped young minds and carried on the legacy of service. More applause. Another sibling, the engineer, who was praised for his brilliance in building solutions for the modern world. The applause swelled after each name, filling the hall with affirmation. I sat unmoving, my palms pressed tightly against my thighs, my jaw set. I knew she would not mention me. The years had taught me this rhythm. Celebrate the children who shone in public roles, and brush aside the one who had chosen a quieter path. Still, The sting always burned fresh. She leaned into the microphone, her tone soft but heavy with meaning. Every one of my children has made me proud with their achievements. Then came the pause. Her eyes flickered toward me again, her lips tugging into that faint smirk she reserved only for me. It wasn't kind. It was calculated. It was her way of letting me know that I was excluded deliberately, not by accident. A bitter thought ran through my head. Ronald Reagan once said, "The greatest leader is not necessarily the one who does the greatest things. He is the one that gets the people to do the greatest things." By that measure, I had been leading battles of my own, building a life without the net of family support, surviving when silence might have crushed others. But in her eyes, it wasn't leadership. It was nothing. The applause roared again, the sound hitting me like waves. My ears rang with it, though my hands remained still, folded neatly in my lap. As her speech continued, I felt my mind drifting, not forward, but backward. I saw again the countless Thanksgivings where the same ritual played out around our crowded dining table. My mother would lift her glass, eyes shining, and toast my siblings. "To the lawyer who wins every case," she would cheer. "To the teacher shaping young lives, to the engineer building a better future." Glasses would clink, laughter would echo, and I would sit there, a ghost at the feast. One year, my brother had covered the cost of her car repair. She announced it proudly, thanking him in front of everyone, praising his generosity. That same holiday, I had fixed her old sewing machine, staying up late to replace a worn belt and restore its smooth hum. She hadn't mentioned it once. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't costly, so to her, it wasn't worth praise. The pattern had always been clear. Recognition flowed upward, toward status and appearances. Never downward, toward the quiet service that kept things alive. But tonight, the difference was sharper, because strangers were watching. It wasn't just a family ritual hidden behind closed doors. It was public, and that made every omission feel like a public erasure. I blinked and forced myself back to the present, where glasses clinked in applause again for my siblings. I stared at the stage, my expression steady, my hands unmoving. No one noticed that I hadn't clapped, or maybe they did and didn't care. Either way, my folded hands were my shield. A relative leaned toward me, her perfume thick in the air. "Your sister really outdid herself this time, didn't she?" she whispered. Her eyes softened with pity as she looked at me, as though acknowledging my absence from the celebration but unwilling to challenge it. I smiled faintly, but I didn't reply. Silence here was safer than words. Sometimes you stay quiet not because you agree, but because explaining yourself to people determined not to see you is exhausting. I turned back to the stage. My mother was raising her glass now, her voice swelling again. "And to my children, who make me proud every day." Her eyes swept the room deliberately, pausing at each sibling's table. When her gaze reached me, it slid right past, like I was no more substantial than air. I felt the chill of it in my chest. In that moment, I knew I wasn't just forgotten. I was being erased, and that erasure would soon become a public spectacle. The hall quieted as my mother shifted her weight at the podium, one manicured hand smoothing her notes. She had finished thanking the church, the community leaders, and the sponsors who helped fund the event. Her voice, warm and deliberate, carried through the room. Then her tone changed. I knew that shift. It was the prelude to the part she relished most, turning her spotlight onto the family. My siblings leaned forward at their front tables, anticipation written in their faces. They were ready to bask in her words, to soak in the validation that had always been reserved for them. The audience grew still, eager to hear what would come next. My pulse thudded in my ears, a steady drumbeat of dread. I could almost feel her sharpening her knife in the silence that stretched. Mark Twain's words ran through my mind. Clothes make the man. Naked people have little or no influence on society. Tonight, it wasn't clothes that stripped me bare. It would be words. Words designed to humiliate, to cut deep while cloaked in a smile. She leaned into the microphone, her voice rising with ease. Each of my children has achieved so much. Her eyes sparkled as she scanned the crowd, pausing deliberately. Except, of course, my youngest, she's still the broke one. The words hit like a slap. Laughter rippled through the hall, bouncing off the high ceiling and spreading like a wave. Some guests chuckled politely, hands over their mouths, while others laughed openly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to mock me in front of 200 people. My soda glass trembled in my hand, droplets running down my wrist like sweat. I steadied it against the table, clenching my jaw so tightly I thought my teeth might crack. A relative beside me leaned over, voice pitched low but loud enough to pierce. "Don't worry, honey," she whispered, as though comforting me. Some people just aren't meant for more. I turned to look at her, my lips pressed together, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. My chest burned, not from shame, but from anger, molten and steady, contained beneath my silence. In America, money is often the loudest applause. Without it, you become the punchline. Tonight, I was her joke, the cheapest laugh in the room. I let my eyes travel across the hall, scanning the faces that had once been neighbors, family friends, church members I had known for years. My siblings shifted uncomfortably. My brother forced a grin, his gaze skittering away from mine. My sister glanced down at her hands, twisting her napkin into a knot. They didn't defend me, but they weren't laughing either. They were complicit in their silence, trapped by the same power that had always kept them obedient. Other guests exchanged looks, some pitying, some smug, as though my humiliation confirmed a story they had long believed. A whisper floated from another table. "Isn't she the one who just fixes junk, toasters and old radios?" The words stung not for their inaccuracy, but for the contempt in their tone. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat thick and unyielding. I would not give them the spectacle of tears. I would not falter in front of the stage she had built to erase me. Resilience sometimes looks like silence, not because you're weak, but because you are saving your voice for the right moment. I replayed her words in my head, the broke one, each repetition landing heavier. It wasn't the first time she had said it, but never like this, never with a microphone in hand, never with an audience to amplify her cruelty. My instinct screamed to stand up, to shout back, to tell them all about the business I had built with my own hands, the clients who trusted me, the families who thanked me when I returned their broken appliances working again. But I forced myself to stay seated. Reacting in the heat of shame would only feed the crowd. That was what she wanted, to provoke me into anger, to confirm her narrative that I was unstable, small. So I chose restraint. I lifted the soda glass to my lips, steady now, and took a slow sip. My hand didn't shake this time. I set it back on the table with quiet precision. Eleanor Roosevelt once said, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." Tonight, I refuse to consent. My silence wasn't surrender. It was a shield. The laughter dulled, replaced by the clinking of glasses and scattered applause. My mother raised her glass, enjoying the way the room bent to her rhythm. She was radiant in that moment, the queen of her kingdom, feeding on the crowd's reaction. My siblings joined in, their laughter thin and nervous, as though they were required to play along. I watched them from my corner, my expression unreadable. My humiliation had become their entertainment, her dominance cemented with every chuckle. But deep inside, a different resolve took root. I thought of all the years I had endured her cuts in private, the dismissals, the omissions, the little jabs slipped into conversations like poisoned needles. Tonight, she had dragged it into the open. She had made it public, and that choice would come back to her. Because when she called me the broke one, she had no idea the truth was about to cash its check. The laughter from my mother's cruel joke still lingered in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. I shifted slightly in my chair, fingers twitching against the damp glass in front of me. I wanted to rise, to correct her, to say something, anything that would reclaim a shred of dignity. But before I could, a voice from a nearby table carried through the hall, sharp as a blade. "She's basically unemployed, isn't she?" The words landed with precision, slicing into me more brutally than my mother's smirk had moments before. A ripple of chuckles followed, filling the hall with the sound of complicity. My mother didn't correct them. She smiled knowingly, lips curved in approval, as though their cruelty confirmed her truth. I felt my throat tighten. My siblings, sitting proudly at their front tables, avoided my eyes. My brother stared fixedly at his napkin. My sister busied herself with adjusting her jewelry. Were they ashamed for me, or simply complicit in their silence? It was hard to tell. I forced my breath steady, repeating in my mind, "In America, we often talk about family as your first safety net. For me, family had always been the trapdoor." The interruptions came like stabs, each one sharper than the last. My chest flared with heat, anger rising beneath the humiliation. Yet I remained rooted, unwilling to give them the performance they wanted. The urge to respond gnawed at me. I pictured standing, lifting my chin, and telling them in a clear voice, "I run a business. I fix things that matter to people. I am not broke. I am not irrelevant." But I also pictured the laughter that would follow, imagined their smirks twisting into ridicule. The scene played out in my mind like a cruel rehearsal, and that image silenced me more effectively than their words. I gripped my soda tighter, the plastic yielding beneath my nails until they bit into my skin. The cold fizz of carbonation burned my throat as I took a sip, masking the fire in my chest. Michelle Obama's words surfaced in my memory. "When they go low, we go high." But tonight, going high didn't mean smiling politely or pretending I wasn't bleeding inside. It meant holding my fire, saving it for when the world couldn't ignore it anymore. So I stayed seated. My silence stretched, heavier than words. It wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Every glance of pity, every smirk, every whisper became fuel for a fire I refused to let die. I straightened my posture, lifting my chin just slightly, eyes steady on the stage. I would not bow my head. My silence unsettled the table. A cousin looked at me expectantly, as though waiting for tears, for me to storm out or collapse. Instead, I took another calm sip, set the glass down with deliberate care, and folded my hands neatly in front of me. Sometimes the most powerful protest is to stay, watch, and remember every detail for when the truth arrives, I thought, my mind recording every smirk, every laugh, every cowardly silence. The room buzzed with voices, conversations layered over one another, but in my corner, I stayed unmoved. Athalia noticed. From the stage, she glanced at me again, her smile faltering for just a moment. She had expected me to break, to shatter beneath the weight of her words. But I didn't. "Why doesn't she just leave?" a cousin whispered behind me. The words floated like smoke, acidic and dismissive, but I stayed rooted. Leaving would have been surrender. Staying, silent, composed, steady, was defiance. I felt the room shifting, ever so slightly. My silence had become louder than their laughter. "You can humiliate me tonight," I told myself, "but you will not erase me." My mother's voice rose again, trying to reclaim control, to steer the moment back to her performance. The crowd leaned in obediently, ready to laugh again at whatever jab she delivered next. My chest tightened, not from fear, but from the certainty that this night was far from over. They thought my silence was surrender, I thought as I gripped my glass one final time, steady and sure. They didn't realize it was strategy. Because in that silence, I was already preparing for the moment the truth would speak louder than all of them. The hall was still vibrating from laughter when my mother basked in the moment, soaking in the admiration as though humiliation was her crown. She gripped the microphone with the ease of someone who believed no one would ever challenge her authority. The spotlight seemed to belong to her, and the audience followed her rhythm like an orchestra responding to its conductor. And then, from the far end of the room, a voice cut through the noise. "Excuse me, may I say something?" The words rang out firm and clear, startling enough to halt the chuckles that still clung to the air. The sound didn't come from a family member or one of the community leaders. It was a different timbre, unfamiliar to most, but immediately recognizable to me. All heads turned. Standing near the back was Serafina Vale. She wore a modest dress, nothing flashy, but her posture carried a quiet authority that demanded attention. Her dark hair was swept back neatly, and her gaze was steady. She didn't shrink from the curious stares. Instead, she stood taller, her chin lifted with purpose. I saw my mother stiffen at the podium. Athalia's practiced smile wavered just for a second before she replaced it with the same polished expression she always wore. She knew Serafina, but clearly hadn't expected her to be here tonight. Guests murmured in confusion. Who was this woman? Why interrupt such a polished, rehearsed event? My mother's recognition night had been meticulously planned, each moment designed to reflect her control. And now, someone else dared to edit the lines. I sat frozen, my soda glass forgotten in my hand. For years, my mother had controlled the script. Tonight, someone else had just picked up the pen. Serafina's presence pulled me back to a memory I had nearly buried. Years ago, she had walked into my small repair shop with panic in her eyes. Her cafe was days away from its grand opening, and both her espresso machines had broken down. If she couldn't serve coffee, she couldn't open. I've already called 3 technicians, she had said desperately, setting her hands flat on my counter. They told me it would take weeks to order the parts. I don't have weeks. I have 2 days. I remembered looking at those heavy machines, hearing the tremor in her voice, and deciding right then I wouldn't let her fail. I spent that night on my workshop floor, sleeves rolled up, manuals spread open, parts scattered around me. By morning, the machines hummed steadily again. When she returned, her eyes filled with relief. "You saved me," she said simply. "I won't forget this." And she hadn't. Now here she was, in the middle of my mother's hall, her voice steady as she faced the podium. Seeing her felt surreal, almost like fate had walked into the room to place its hand on my shoulder. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "The time is always right to do what is right." Maybe this was her time, and mine. Serafina took a few steps forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her presence drawing the eyes of everyone in the hall. She stopped just short of the stage and addressed Athalia directly. "With respect," she said, her voice calm but firm. "May I take the mic for a moment?" Gasps scattered through the audience. Some leaned forward eagerly, hungry for whatever spectacle was about to unfold. Others exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't part of the program. My mother's smile faltered again. For a beat too long, she said nothing. Her fingers tightened around the microphone, knuckles whitening under the light. Then, forced by the etiquette of the crowd and the eyes now pinned on her, she inclined her head. "Of course," she said smoothly, though her tone cracked ever so slightly. The MC, caught off guard, hesitated, but when Athalia gestured, he shuffled awkwardly, crossing the stage to hand Serafina the microphone. The weight of the moment pressed against the room like a held breath. I stayed still, my heart pounding. Only minutes earlier, I had been the room's joke, stripped down by words and laughter. Now someone else was standing, taking the risk of speaking truth in a hall that had mocked me. Sometimes the truth doesn't knock. It walks straight to the front of the room. The crowd's unease grew thick. Murmurs rippled like small waves, uncertain whether they were witnessing part of the celebration or the unraveling of it. My siblings shifted in their chairs, exchanging nervous glances. My brother tugged at his collar, his face pale. My sister bit her lip, staring down at the tablecloth. Athalia tried to hold her composure, lips stretched into a smile that didn't reach her eyes, but her gaze, sharp and narrowing, was fixed on Serafina. The atmosphere had shifted completely. This was no longer her stage alone. Authority is fragile. It lasts only until someone dares to stand and say, "Wait." The whispers softened as Serafina raised the microphone. She didn't rush. She let the silence draw out, letting every pair of eyes lock on her before she began. "You've praised your children tonight," she said, her voice even, carrying clearly across the hall. "But there is something about your youngest that everyone here deserves to know." My pulse raced, each beat heavy in my chest. The laughter that had mocked me minutes ago was gone. The silence now was louder than applause, thick with anticipation. And in that silence, I realized the stage was no longer hers, but mine, waiting to be reclaimed. Serafina's grip on the microphone was calm, but her presence had shifted the weight of the room entirely. What had moments ago been a showcase of my mother's authority now felt brittle, fragile, like glass under strain. She cleared her throat, a small sound that echoed louder than any applause. "You've spoken proudly of your children, Athalia," she began, her voice firm, measured. But pride without truth is a mask. The sentence landed like a stone thrown into still water. Conversations cut short. Glasses stopped midair. All eyes locked on her. From where I sat, I saw her other hand slide into the leather tote she carried and draw out a folder. The edges were bent from use, but her hand did not shake. She held it up so the bold print could be seen under the lights. Loan agreement. Gasps broke across the hall. Some leaned forward, squinting to see, while others covered their mouths, already whispering. My stomach lurched, flipping in recognition. This was the secret my mother had always feared might surface. Secrets are like debts. They collect interest until the day they're due, and tonight, the collector had arrived. My mother stiffened, her smile frozen in place, but her eyes betrayed her, sharp, panicked, a flicker of dread she couldn't disguise. This, Serafina continued, tapping the folder with a steady finger, nearly cost me my livelihood. It was not your charity, not your reputation that saved me. It was your daughter sitting right there. Her hand pointed toward me. The spotlight seemed to follow, though I hadn't moved. Heads turned, the shift of attention like a wave crashing against me. For once, I wasn't invisible. Murmurs rose like a tide. Her? Someone whispered. She saved her? Others shook their heads, stunned. My mother opened her mouth to interject, but Serafina's voice surged stronger, overriding her. She worked through the night. She repaired what money couldn't. Without her, I would have lost everything. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. For once, the room wasn't laughing at me. They were listening. Athalia's hand clenched the stem of her wine glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. She leaned toward the microphone, desperate to reclaim her narrative. This is... she began, but Serafina didn't flinch. No, she said firmly, her voice cutting across the hall. This is truth. And truth doesn't wait for permission. I felt a strange calm settle over me. For years I had carried their dismissals, their smirks, their public jokes. Tonight, I didn't have to fight for myself. The truth had chosen its own advocate. The audience shifted, murmurs swelling into outrage. She saved her business? One said incredulously. And her mother called her broke? The disdain grew audible. Guests exchanged looks, some turning openly toward my mother with narrowed eyes. My siblings fidgeted visibly. My brother lowered his head, unable to meet anyone's gaze. My sister pressed her lips together, embarrassed but silent. I remained seated, hands folded, my silence deliberate. I didn't need to raise my voice. The truth was raising it for me. Sometimes you don't need to fight. You only need the truth to fight for you. In American culture, reputation is currency. And tonight, my mother's balance had plummeted. She tried again, forcing a brittle laugh. These are old papers, misunderstandings. They're irrelevant now. But Serafina shook her head, stepping closer to the stage. Irrelevant. You borrowed. You failed to repay. And when the walls closed in, it wasn't you who saved the day. It was your daughter. She repaired more than machines. She repaired your dignity, and you erased her. The crowd stirred sharply, their whispers now edged with judgment, eyes narrowed. Some shook their heads, disgust plain. The air was no longer hers to command. Her power cracked, not with a scream, but with the rustle of papers under the light. Serafina walked forward, her heels striking the floor in deliberate beats, and laid the folder flat on the table set before the stage. The sound of paper hitting wood echoed like a gavel. The truth deserves its place at the head table, she said clearly, her voice reverberating through the hall, even when the family does not. Gasps rippled again. Athalia's hand trembled as she reached for her glass of wine, her mask slipping. I exhaled, calm but electric inside. This was only the beginning of the storm. Because once the truth sat on the table, nothing in that hall would ever sit the same again. After Serafina placed the documents on the table, the room fell into a silence so absolute it seemed unnatural. The chatter, the clinking glasses, the scattered laughs that had filled the hall only moments earlier, gone. What remained was a stillness that made every small sound echo louder than thunder. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the muffled shuffle of shoes as someone adjusted in their chair, even the delicate clink of a single glass being set back down on porcelain. Across the hall, my mother stood at the podium, her smile frozen like a mask. The pearls around her neck caught the light, but her face had gone pale, drained of the authority she had carried so effortlessly moments before. For decades, she had wielded her reputation like armor, unbreakable. But now, as the papers lay flat under the spotlight, the cracks in that armor were visible to all. Power doesn't always fall with a bang. Sometimes it collapses under the weight of truth, like a structure that looks strong until the beam snaps. For years, she had orchestrated my humiliation in whispers and carefully chosen barbs. Tonight, one folder of papers had upended her throne. The silence did not end in applause, nor in words of comfort. It broke in the soft, insistent murmur of whispers. "She owes money?" someone hissed from the table nearest the stage. "The daughter saved the business?" came another voice, pitched high with disbelief. "And she mocked her as broke?" The whispers spread like sparks in dry grass, moving from table to table. A chorus of low voices filled the hall, layered on top of one another, growing louder, more insistent. I felt the shift in the air. Some guests shook their heads, disgust plain on their faces. Others stole glances at me, their eyes no longer dismissive, but searching, curious, even guilty. A few gazes softened into something that resembled pity or respect, though neither was what I sought. In American culture, gossip isn't just chatter, it's currency. And tonight, it was bankrupting my mother. I kept my hands folded in my lap, watching it all unfold. This was not my moment to seize, not yet. Serafina's voice and the whispers were doing what my years of silence could not. On the stage, my mother cleared her throat, forcing a brittle laugh. "Old papers," she said, her voice pitched higher than usual, brittle around the edges. "Taken out of context. We've all had debts." Her attempt at dismissal landed flat. Too many eyes had already shifted against her. She gestured toward the audience, forcing another laugh. "Let's not make too much of this." A friend of hers at one of the front tables tried to clap, but the sound was awkward, scattered, and fizzled out almost immediately. I watched her composure crack with every second. She clung to her script, desperate to wrest back control, but her authority had slipped through her fingers. Reputation is like glass. You can polish it for years, but one stone of truth shatters it forever. I sat quietly, my face calm, but inside, I felt something loosen. Not triumph, something deeper, like a knot in my chest that had begun to untangle. The crowd murmured again, voices overlapping, louder now. "She lied all these years?" one woman whispered harshly. "And humiliated her daughter?" Another voice added, "I never thought Athalia would stoop to this, calling her broke while hiding this kind of debt." My mother's words came faster, choppy, desperate interjections that did not land. "It's not as it looks," she said quickly, almost snapping. "Everyone here has faced struggles. These papers don't tell the whole story." But the crowd had stopped believing her. My siblings squirmed at their tables. My brother pinched the bridge of his nose, his face flushed. My sister leaned back, folding her arms, her lips pressed into a hard line. None of them came to her defense. None of them dared. Through it all, I remained still. I did not need to rise, did not need to shout. My silence was louder than her excuses. I remembered Eleanor Roosevelt's words, spoken to me once by a teacher when I was a girl. "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." Tonight, I did not consent. This wasn't my battle to shout through. The truth shouted louder than I ever could. Guests turned to look at me now, expecting a reaction, perhaps a speech. I gave them none. I sat straight-backed, my chin lifted slightly, and let the weight of Serafina's revelation carry itself. Athalia's hand trembled visibly as she gripped her wineglass. The fine crystal caught the light, but the liquid inside rippled as her fingers shook. She tried to lift it, to take a steady sip, but the glass knocked against her teeth, a sharp clink that echoed louder than she intended. The whispers swelled into something heavier, a tide that could not be reversed. Judgment hung in the air like smoke, irreversible now. For years, she had scripted my humiliation. Tonight, she lost the pen. And in that trembling silence, I knew the storm had only just begun. The room hadn't settled after Serafina's revelation. The whispers grew louder, colliding into one another until they became a roar. I sat still in my chair, my hands folded neatly, but my gaze drifted toward my father. He had been silent all night, a shadow at the edge of the event, letting my mother take her spotlight. For a moment, I let myself believe he might finally speak. He could step in, offer even the smallest sign that I wasn't alone in this. But instead, his eyes slid away from mine. He turned his face toward the opposite wall, refusing to meet my gaze, refusing to acknowledge me. The rejection hit harder than the laughter had. Sometimes betrayal isn't what someone says, it's what they refuse to say. His silence weighed more than the judgment of the entire hall. People noticed. Heads turned, following the movement of his eyes. The shame that already hung heavy in the air seemed to sink deeper, pressing into me, suffocating. In American families, fathers are expected to step in during conflict, to act as a stabilizer when the household fractures. His withdrawal wasn't neutrality, it was abandonment, and it was public. I swallowed down the ache rising in my chest. He had chosen the easier path, silence, retreat, averted eyes, while mine had always been the harder one. Athalia tried to regain her footing, but the audience was no longer hers. The murmurs became sharp-edged words that carried across the room. "Even her husband won't look at her," one man said, shaking his head. "What kind of mother humiliates her own child?" Another voice cut in. My siblings stayed frozen, caught in the middle, unsure whether to stand in her defense or remain hidden in their silence. My brother twisted his napkin until it tore. My sister stared down at the floor, avoiding the storm entirely. I felt strangely calm, as though the storm had already passed and I was sitting among the wreckage it left behind. There was no undoing this. No speech could erase what had been spoken. No polished smile could restore the image she had guarded so carefully. When truth comes out, it doesn't ask if you're ready. It just arrives and demands you deal with it. The program sputtered to an awkward close. Applause was sparse and scattered, forced from those too polite to leave without clapping. People stood in small clusters, their conversations low but sharp, their eyes sliding toward my mother with open judgment. One or two came to squeeze my shoulder, quiet gestures of solidarity that surprised me more than they should have. As the crowd thinned, I rose from my seat, taking the long way toward the exit, but Athalia intercepted me in the hallway outside the banquet hall. Her heels clicked sharply against the tile as she cornered me by the side door. Her face was tight with fury, eyes blazing in a way I hadn't seen since childhood. "Why didn't you stop her?" she hissed, her words slicing the quiet. "You let her humiliate me." I met her glare with calm. "I didn't have to stop her," I said evenly. She told the truth. "You've always been ungrateful," she spat. "Everything I did was for this family." The words landed with the weight of years behind them, but I had heard them too many times before, used like a shield for her cruelty. I felt something steady in me, like a wall rising where there used to be cracks. "You didn't do it for us," I replied quietly. "You did it for your image. You broke me down to build yourself up." Her breath caught, fury twisting her features. "You think you're better than me now? Because of some shop, some repairs?" I held her gaze. "No, I think I survived despite you. That's the difference." Family manipulation often hides behind the word sacrifice. But real sacrifice doesn't demand humiliation in return. The exchange cut like knives, quick, sharp, leaving no room for pretense. Each word from her was an attempt to reclaim control. Each answer from me stripped that control further away. I realized in that moment that this confrontation wasn't about her words. It was about her fear. Fear of losing the image she had built. Fear of a daughter she could no longer control. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to defend myself. I let her accusations hang in the air, empty and brittle. Her rage wasn't mine to carry. Her downfall wasn't my responsibility. Her voice shook as she spat her last line. "You'll regret this." I stood firm, meeting her eyes steadily. My silence was sharper than any rebuttal. She thought I was still afraid of her. She didn't see that fear had left me the moment truth walked into the room, because her threats no longer bound me. They were chains I had already broken. The hall emptied slower than usual, as though people wanted to linger and see what would happen next. After Serafina's bombshell, after my mother's excuses fell flat, after the whispers built into something sharp and dangerous, the balance in that room had shifted for good. I felt it in the way people looked at me, not dismissive anymore, not as the afterthought in the shadows, but as someone who had endured humiliation without flinching. One by one, they came to me. A neighbor from church, her eyes soft, squeezed my hand. "You've held your head high," she said. "That takes more courage than anything." Another guest leaned down to murmur, "I had no idea. You deserved better tonight." The words were small, simple, but they chipped away at the years of invisibility I had lived with. Meanwhile, Athalia sat stiff at her table, pearls askew, the practiced smile gone. No one clustered around her anymore. People skirted her presence, polite nods replacing the usual fawning. For years, she had been the axis of every room, drawing admiration like a magnet. Tonight, that magnet had lost its pull. Reputation is borrowed, character is owned. Tonight, my mother's credit had run out. The shift in loyalty was deliberate, visible. Guests approached me in ones and twos, offering quiet support, while her side of the room emptied. She tried to summon them with her eyes, to coax back the old rhythm of attention, but it was gone. Then I noticed the glow. Phones were out, screens lit, thumbs tapping. Several guests had recorded Serafina's reveal. I could see the videos replaying already on their screens. Some mouths whispered over them, "This is going to get out. Everyone will know." Truth doesn't just live in whispers anymore. It lives online, where silence cannot bury it. I heard snippets of their commentary as they showed each other. "She owes money." Called her daughter broke in public? Imagine, praised in charity circles while treating her child like this. The outrage swirled, buzzing like bees stirred from their hive. My siblings shrank further back into their chairs. My brother rubbed his forehead as though warding off a headache. My sister folded her arms tight, eyes darting between our mother and the crowd, calculating her own escape. They wouldn't defend her now, not when the tide had turned. Athalia tried again to claw back her dignity. She rose slowly, forcing a smile that quivered around the edges. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she said, her voice too bright, too rehearsed. "Your support means so much." The applause that followed was polite but hollow, no enthusiasm behind it. People clapped because it was expected, not because they meant it. I watched her eyes flick desperately from face to face, looking for the warmth that had always been hers. It wasn't there. The pastor, who had once praised her as the model of charity, approached briefly. His handshake was quick, his nod curt. He didn't linger. That brief hesitation, that thin acknowledgement, cut sharper than any words. Respect is like glass. Once cracked, everyone sees the lines, no matter how much you polish. I sat in silence, letting her reap what she had sown. Years of humiliation, years of carefully crafted narratives at my expense, all of it collapsing in real time. There was no need for me to move. Her downfall was happening without my hand. Guests began leaving early. Chairs scraped back, coats were pulled on, conversations ended abruptly. Where once they might have lingered long into the evening, laughing at her stories, now they wanted distance. They wanted to be gone before the cracks widened further. Through it all, I remained still, straight-backed, calm. A few came to me, their words soft but meaningful. "You handled yourself with grace. You didn't have to say a word. Everyone saw." I accepted their kindness without gloating, without boasting. My silence spoke louder than anything else. Americans admire resilience more than revenge. Tonight, I chose dignity over spectacle. Maya Angelou's words floated back to me, a reminder I had clung to in darker nights. "Still, like air, I'll rise." And in that hall, With my mother's empire crumbling quietly, I felt the truth of it in my bones. Athelia watched me across the room. Her face had lost its color, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. She looked at me not with authority anymore, but with fear. Fear of what I had become by staying silent. My father still would not meet her gaze. His silence was louder than condemnation, and she knew it. For years, I was her shadow. Tonight, she became mine. But shadows stretch far, and I knew the reckoning wasn't finished yet. The hall emptied slowly, as if the air itself was reluctant to leave the scene of collapse. Conversations had dwindled into murmurs, the echo of whispers still clinging to the rafters like smoke. I remained seated for a long moment, my hands folded in my lap, allowing the weight of the evening to settle on me fully. Guests drifted past, some offering brief nods or murmured phrases. "You were stronger than I could have been." Or, "Hold your head high, you did the right thing." I absorbed their words quietly, not out of modesty, but because I knew this wasn't victory. It was survival. My siblings slipped out without a word, their shame visible in the way their shoulders hunched, their eyes carefully avoiding mine. They couldn't bring themselves to face me, nor to face the truth Serafina had laid bare. Athelia stayed seated at her table, her back rigid, fingers wrapped around a glass of wine she never drank. Her hand trembled, and the liquid shivered with it, betraying what her mask still tried to hide. Power doesn't just end in front of crowds, it ends in the silence after they leave, when even your own family avoids your eyes. I exhaled slowly, my chest easing for the first time in years. As the crowd thinned to a trickle, I saw a figure step away from the doorway and approach. It took me a moment to recognize her. Odessa? The voice was tentative, but familiar. It was an old friend from high school, Melissa. She had been there before all of this, before the fractures and the titles, when life was simpler, and I still believed my mother's approval was within reach. "I saw what happened," she said softly, pulling me into a quick embrace. "I always knew you had more strength than they ever gave you credit for." Her words struck something deep inside me, something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Validation not tied to a title or a paycheck, but to who I was. Her presence felt like an anchor. For the first time that night, I didn't feel entirely alone. We talked briefly, standing off to the side while the staff began clearing tables. She recalled how I had helped her study for an exam when no one else thought she'd pass. "You were always the one who showed up," she said with a smile, "even when no one noticed." Hope doesn't always roar. Sometimes it comes in the quiet voice of someone who remembers who you were before the hurt. I nodded, gratitude softening the ache inside me. "Thank you," I whispered. Her hand squeezed mine before she left, and I carried that small act of kindness like a lantern in the dark. When I finally gathered my things and turned toward the exit, my path was blocked. Athelia stood there, her silhouette sharp against the dim hallway light. Her voice was low, but every word was honed like a blade. "You think this makes you stronger? You think letting her humiliate me in front of everyone will make you something?" I didn't flinch. I didn't let her. She told the truth. Her lips curled into a sneer. "You've always been ungrateful. Everything I did was for this family." I steadied my voice, calm but clear. "No. You did it for your image, and you broke me down to build yourself up." Her face twisted with fury. "You'll regret turning against your family." "No," I said firmly, holding her gaze. "I regret letting you convince me I was less than I am." The air between us thickened, charged with years of unspoken battles. Her rage shook like a storm barely contained, but my calm defiance cut louder than her accusations. Control only works as long as you let it. Tonight, I cut the leash. I didn't prolong it. I stepped aside, creating space between us, not just in the hallway, but in my life. For the first time, I felt the weight lift, not because she had changed, but because I had stopped carrying her judgment as truth. Independence isn't loud. Sometimes it's just walking away and never turning back. I pushed open the doors and stepped into the night. The cool air rushed against my face, washing away the heaviness of the hall. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Messages were already flooding in, Videos spreading online, voices louder than whispers now. She had tried to chain me with shame. Tonight those chains broke, but freedom always comes with a cost, and I knew the final price had yet to be paid. The crowd was still buzzing, their voices echoing faintly as they filtered toward the doors, but I stayed rooted in place. I wasn't ready to leave just yet. The weight of everything that had happened pressed on me, but beneath it there was something else: resolve. My mother's empire of appearances had cracked, and there was one more thing I needed to do before I walked away. I rose slowly, smoothing my blouse with deliberate hands. Conversations around me hushed again, as though they sensed I hadn't finished. My steps carried me to the front table, where Serafina's folder still lay, its edges curled, the papers inside like an open wound. From my purse, I drew out a small folded receipt. It was yellowed at the corners, ink faded from years in a drawer. Proof of repairs I had once made, a debt tied to my mother's failures, my work keeping her afloat when she couldn't admit she was drowning. Without ceremony, I placed it atop the stack of documents. Gasps rippled through the hall. I didn't need words. The gesture was enough. Sometimes revenge doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers so loud the guilty can't ignore it. I felt eyes on me, wide and unblinking, watching as I turned from the table. My hand brushed against the edge of my blouse, where the stiff little name tag still clung. Helper. I stopped, fingers tugging at the pin until it came free. I held it in my palm, staring at the word that had mocked me all night. Then, with steady steps, I crossed to the microphone stand. The room went utterly silent as I reached up and placed the tag on top of the microphone. The thin piece of plastic looked small, but the sound it made against the metal echoed louder than any speech I could have given. They all understood. The title they'd used to diminish me was now on display, stripped of its power, transformed into proof of their blindness. They wanted me labeled the broke one. Tonight, I chose my own label, Survivor. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate. My mother sat frozen, eyes locked on the tag, her body rigid. She couldn't reclaim the stage, not now, not ever. I turned toward the exit, my steps steady, deliberate, unhurried. Each one carried more weight than any words I could have spoken. Guests stepped aside instinctively, some reaching out to touch my shoulder as I passed, their hands pressing softly, silently affirming what words couldn't. Athalia didn't move. Her gaze stayed fixed on that small square of plastic, as though it tethered her to the spot. My father stared at the floor, his silence as condemning as any verdict. True victory isn't applause, it's the silence left when no one dares laugh anymore. The doors opened ahead of me, and I walked through them with a solemn march. The cool Cleveland night met me outside, air crisp against my face. I breathed deeply, chest rising with something that felt like freedom. Not because she gave it to me, but because I had taken it for myself. My phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out, screen glowing with messages pouring in. Strangers, acquaintances, old friends, all writing because they had seen the video, because the truth had already spilled into the world beyond the hall. One message read, "You reminded me of my own story. Thank you for standing tall when I couldn't. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about giving others the courage to rise." I tucked the phone away, lifting my eyes to the horizon. Streetlights stretched down the block, their glow soft in the night. I felt lighter than I had in years. For years, I was her shadow. Tonight, I stepped into my own light. And if she calls me the broke one again, I'll smile, because I know the only thing broken now is her illusion. Because sometimes the greatest revenge is not destroying your enemy, it's living free of them forever.